welcome to Bible Bootcamp week number 5. And this week we're going to be looking at the section of the Bible story that's in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings 1 to 10, and also 1st Chronicles. And it's the story of how Israel becomes a united kingdom, first under King Saul, then under King David, and finally under King Solomon. But the story starts at the end of Judges, where the people, we're told, everybody did what was right in their own eyes because they had no king. So they go to Samuel and they say to Samuel, we want a king like all the other nations have got. We want a king like that. And Samuel says, well, a king like all the other nations have got will just take tax from you, will take some of your land, take your daughters to work in the palace. You don't want a king like the other nations. You want a different kind of king. But nonetheless, God agrees to give them what they ask for.
And so we're introduced to the figure of Saul. He begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good-looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king. But he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. The aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him, David. He's the least likely candidate to be king, but the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. From here, we watch Saul slowly descend into madness while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, and he's also winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing David around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong, and so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible, because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations.
Things are looking quite good under King David, but then he slides into moral failure too. He sleeps with another man's wife and then has the man killed, and his family degenerates into chaotic infighting. But in the middle of it all, he has a son, Solomon, who does ascend the throne when David dies, and who does build the temple. Such is Solomon's wisdom that he asks God specially for, and such is his magnificence and wealth and opulence that the Queen of Sheba travels from far away to witness how marvelous it all is. Surely this is the fulfillment of God's promise. But as we'll see next time, that's not the case. In fact, the true king to come would be Jesus.